The fluorescent lights hummed above Seattle General's fifth floor like insects trapped in glass. Brooke Sullivan pushed a vital signs cart down the corridor, her movements efficient, economical, the way someone moves when they've learned that wasted motion can cost lives. Scrubs pressed and pale blue, her name badge clipped at an angle so it never caught light. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs, a secret stitched in thread so old it had turned the color of dust. 3 years. 3 quiet years at Seattle General in San Diego, and no one had ever asked her name. The morning smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and the faint metallic tang of something that might have been fear or might have been just the hospital's particular way of making you aware of your own mortality. She stopped at room 512, checking the chart clip to the door frame. Mr. Venkatesan, 67, post-op day 3, splenectomy, vital stable but O2 sat hovering at 91. She'd flagged it yesterday. The surgical notes from Dr. Marcus Caldwell indicated nothing of concern. She knew better. The patient was awake when she entered, his daughter sitting in the vinyl chair beside the bed, scrolling through her phone. Brooke moved to the monitors without announcing herself, the way people move through spaces they've already mapped 1,000 times. Her hands found the pulse oximeter, the blood pressure cuff, the 4-line, checking not the machines but the patient, reading his face, the shallow rise of his chest, the slight pallor around his lips. "How are we feeling this morning?" she asked, and her voice carried something that made the daughter look up. Not warmth exactly. Something more like authority disguised as gentleness. "Tired," Mr. Venkatesan said. "They said I could go home tomorrow." Brooke's jaw tightened. Just slightly. No one who wasn't trained to notice tension in people would have seen it. "Let's check your breathing first." She placed the stethoscope against his chest, listening not just to the lungs but to what the lungs were trying to tell her. Wheezing at the bases. Crackles that weren't there yesterday. The sound of fluid where there should only be air. She lifted the stethoscope and made a note in his chart. "I'm going to call your surgical team. Just want to be thorough." The daughter was already looking worried. "Is something wrong?" "Probably nothing," Brooke said, which was the lie she'd learned to tell, the lie that kept people calm and kept her invisible. "Just routine follow-up." She stepped out into the hallway and pulled her phone from her scrub pocket, a battered Samsung that made the younger nurses smirk, and called the surgical team. Caldwell's resident answered on the third ring, a kid named Torres with a voice like he'd swallowed gravel. "Patient in 512 presenting with decreased O2 sat and new bacillar crackles," Brooke said. "Post-op day 3. I want imaging before discharge." "Did you check the chart?" Torres asked. Not rude, just tired. "I checked the patient," Brooke replied. "The chart is what Caldwell wrote. The patient is what I'm listening to." A pause. "I'll mention it to him." She hung up before Torres could hedge any further and stood for a moment in the middle of the corridor, letting her breathing settle. The hallway was quiet at this hour, just past 6 in the morning, before the chaos of day's shift arrived. Before Caldwell arrived. She turned and nearly collided with him. Dr. Marcus Caldwell was the kind of tool that made doorways seem like afterthoughts, his presence the way a storm system changes air pressure in a room. 53 years old, board-certified, published researcher, chief of surgery for 3 years running, and possessed of the particular arrogance that came from never being told no. His eyes were the color of faded denim, and they passed over Brooke as if she were equipment that needed servicing. "Nurse Sullivan," he said, and the way he said it made it sound like a diagnosis of something treatable but tedious. "Good morning, doctor." He was holding a coffee from the attending physician's lounge, genuine espresso, not the thin brown water from the break room. His tie was silk. His watch was the kind that cost more than Brooke's car. Everything about him was arranged to communicate, "I have already won the argument before you knew we were having one. I trust you're documenting your shift appropriately," he said. "Not getting ahead of yourself with clinical assessments." She met his eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough that he would know she'd heard him. "Of course, doctor." He walked past her toward the nursing station, coffee in hand, the fabric of his coat catching light like it was designed to. Brooke stood in the hallway for 3 seconds, counting her breaths. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Pain is data. Fear is information. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 3 years of training herself to be invisible, to fold small, to accept the particular humiliation of being the person in the room who knows something but has no right to say it. She went back into room 512 and found Mr. Venkatesan's daughter reading the discharge papers. "Those aren't approved yet," Brooke said quietly. "The doctor said." "The doctor hasn't seen the imaging we're ordering." "Not yet." "Can I get you some coffee while we wait?" The daughter hesitated, then nodded. Brooke left the room and made her way down to the break room, moving through the hospital the way she'd learned to move through other places, present but not occupying space, visible but unremarkable. 2 nurses from night shift were finishing their charting. They glanced up when she entered, then looked away. One of them gathered her laptop and left. The other followed a moment later, leaving their half-empty coffee cups on the table. Brooke had stopped noticing when she entered rooms and conversations died. That was year 2. By year 3, it felt normal. The break room was cooler than the hallway, and it smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness that came from a refrigerator full of lunches no one would ever eat. She filled a mug from the community pot, weak, bitter, tasting like it had been warming since midnight, and stood at the window looking out over San Diego sprawling toward the Pacific. She could see the parking lot from here. The corner where she'd parked her truck, a 2009 Tacoma with primer spots and 43,000 miles that she'd bought with cash from a bank account she'd had to explain to no one. She'd been careful about that. About everything. Stay small. Stay quiet. Don't ask for anything. Don't let anyone see you want anything. Don't let anyone see you're capable of anything they might find threatening. When the nurses had left, when she was alone in the break room with its humming refrigerator and its flickering lights, she turned back toward the window and reached inside her scrub jacket. Her fingers found the place where the thread had frayed almost to nothing, where the stitches had gone nearly invisible from 2 decades of washing and re-washing. The patch was maybe 4 inches square, faded to a color that was almost colorless, the sand and gray of a place most people would rather forget existed. Marja. The letters were barely legible anymore, and the insignia underneath had faded to a ghost, but she'd memorized it so thoroughly over 20 years that her fingers could read it like Braille. She didn't pull it out. She never pulled it out. She just touched it for a moment, the way someone might touch a scar to remind themselves that they'd survived whatever created it. Footsteps in the hallway. Coming closer. She released the patch, smoothed her jacket, and turned back to her coffee. By the time the door opened and Dr. Caldwell's resident appeared, Torres, looking harried and already running behind, Brooke was just another nurse in scrubs, just another person folding herself smaller than she actually was. "Dr. Caldwell wants imaging on 512, Torres said, not quite meeting her eyes. "CT chest with contrast." "I'll get them downstairs," Brooke said. Torres left. She finished her coffee and walked back to the patient care area, the patch pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat, like a secret, like the only part of her that still remembered how to breathe without asking for permission. Mr. Venkatesan's CT would show early acute respiratory distress, secondary to post-operative bleed. The imaging would matter. The imaging would save his life, and Dr. Caldwell would never know that a floor nurse had seen it coming before the scans confirmed what her hands had already told her. That was the deal. That was what she'd agreed to when she'd taken this job, when she'd sewn this patch into her jacket lining and decided to disappear into a life so small no one could possibly recognize what she'd been. It was a good deal. She'd learned to tell herself that. Most days, she almost believed it. But that morning, as she walked back toward room 512 with the imaging requisition in her hand, she didn't notice the way patients in the hallway watched her pass, how their eyes tracked her with something that looked almost like relief, the way a room full of people might watch someone who'd just walked in carrying water during a fire. She didn't notice how the senior residents in the patient care area glanced toward her whenever something in a chart didn't add up, the way they waited to see what she would catch before they said anything. She didn't notice any of it, because noticing would mean admitting that something was wrong about the way she'd learned to exist, and admitting that would mean changing everything. Which meant she also didn't notice Dr. Marcus Caldwell standing at the nurse's station, watching her with the particular intensity of someone who'd just realized that the machinery of the hospital might not respond to him the way it should. His coffee was already cold. His coffee was already cold. Caldwell set it down on the desk outside room 547 and checked his watch, 11:11 a.m. Visiting hours. The sepsis case. He'd been waiting for this moment since she'd flagged his post-op protocol 3 days ago, since she'd dared to question his surgical judgment in front of the morning rounds. The family was already inside, gathered around the bed like mourners at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. He straightened his white coat, the one with the monogrammed cuffs, and pushed through the door. Brooke was already in the room, adjusting the foredrip, her movements economical and precise. She didn't startle when he entered. She never did. That was the problem. A normal nurse would have straightened, deferred, made space. Brooke simply continued her work, as if the room's hierarchy didn't shift the moment he walked through the door. The family turned their heads, a wife in a blue cardigan, 2 adult children in their 30s, all of them watching with the particular intensity of people who'd learned to read oxygen saturation numbers and fever charts in the last 72 hours. Nurse Sullivan, Caldwell said, his voice pitched to carry authority without volume. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Walk me through why you flagged my post-op protocol. Brooke finished adjusting the drip and turned to face him. Her eyes were steady. That steadiness was something he'd learned to recognize and resent. She gestured to the monitor, where vital signs scrolled in green numbers against a dark background. WBC elevated from 16,000 to 22,000 in 48 hours, she said. Her tone was clinical, calm, the voice of someone reciting data that mattered. Lactate climbed from 2.1 to 4.3. Temperature spiked to 103.4 at 6 a.m. I flagged the post-op protocol because infection markers don't match the discharge parameters you documented. The wife shifted forward in her chair. One of the children, the daughter, pulled out a phone, fingers moving. Note-taking. They were listening. That was exactly what Caldwell couldn't allow to continue. This, he said, his voice dropping into the register he reserved for teaching rounds and humiliation, is exactly the problem. Your persistent overreach beyond nursing scope. You're a floor nurse, Sullivan. Not a diagnostician. Not a physician. You have 3 semesters of clinical training and a license that says bedpan and blood pressure. Stick to what's within your scope. The charting decisions are mine. He paused, letting the silence settle like sediment. The family doesn't need speculation from nursing staff. It creates confusion. Anxiety. Undermines the care plan. Clipboard Clara doesn't get to second-guess the surgeon. He'd used the nickname before. It had worked the other times. He'd watched her absorb the dismissal, nod, retreat. But something in her face shifted now, just barely. A tightness around her eyes. Her jaw set for 1 breath, 2 breaths, and then she took a measured breath of her own, the kind of deliberate inhale that came from somewhere deep and disciplined. The wife reached across and squeezed the patient's hand. The daughter had stopped typing on her phone. Understood, Doctor, Brooke said. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still level, still clinical. But something underneath it had shifted tone, the way a guitar string sounds different when you change the tension. She turned back to the 4, her movements exactly as before, economical, precise, utterly unbothered by his authority. That wasn't right. That wasn't the reaction he needed. He left the room and went directly to the nurse's station, where he found the unit board, the one that posted schedule changes, staff announcements, and official notices. He extracted a piece of paper from his pocket, already filled out, already dated, already signed. He didn't write it now. He'd written it yesterday, on his desk in his office, in the careful script of someone who'd learned to document decisions as though they were medical necessity. He taped it to the board under the header "Performance Concerns" in bold black letters, and he made sure it was positioned where everyone would see it first thing when they clocked in for their shift. Formal right UP, R.N. Sullivan, insubordination, scope violations, undermining physician authority. Remedial training required. M. Caldwell, Chief of Surgery. He stepped back and surveyed it. 12 other staff members would see this before she did. 12 people would read his assessment before she could contextualize it, before she could explain, before she could do anything but absorb the public nature of the accusation. The board wasn't private. Patients saw this board. Family saw this board. It was democracy of humiliation. What he didn't account for was that she wouldn't care about the write-up at all. She arrived for her shift the next morning at 6:45 a.m., and the break room went quiet. Not gradually, instantly. A nurse mid-sentence about the night shift stopped talking. An orderly who'd been laughing at something on his phone pocketed it. A resident gathering her lunch from the refrigerator suddenly became very focused on peeling an orange. Brooke set her own lunch down on the counter, a Tupperware container, turkey sandwich visible through the plastic, and moved toward the corner table where she always sat today. Within 90 seconds, the room had emptied. The nurse who'd been talking gathered her coffee. The orderly checked his watch as if something urgent had suddenly materialized. The resident abandoned the orange and walked out with it half-peeled, juice dripping from her fingers. Even the unit secretary, who worked at the break room desk, found a reason to step out. A moment later, Brooke could hear them in the hallway outside, clustered near the supply closet, voices low, glancing back toward the break room window where she sat at the corner table, her untouched sandwich in front of her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone had left a magazine on the table, something about celebrity divorces. Brooke didn't look at it. She looked at her hands instead, at the veins that showed clearly when she spread her fingers, at the calluses that hadn't faded despite 3 years at Seattle General, despite this life of quiet competence that nobody noticed. Pain is data. Her hands had learned that lesson in the dust of Marja, where a 7-year-old boy lay with his intestines exposed to the sky and mortars walked closer with each explosion. Pain is data. Stay still. Stay focused. Stay invisible. She was still sitting when she heard the sound of his shoes on the tile. Caldwell passed the break room window without looking in. But she'd felt him looking. She felt the weight of his attention like something physical, like pressure against her chest. She rose, gathered her untouched lunch, and moved into the hallway. He was 20 feet ahead, already moving toward the nurse's station, already distracted by whatever satisfaction the morning had brought him. She met his eyes when he turned back. "Patients don't read org charts, doctor," she said. Her voice came out exactly as she'd practiced it alone in her apartment, measured and quiet, the kind of voice that carried weight not because it was loud but because it came from absolute stillness. They read results. His face darkened. But before he could respond, before he could say whatever cutting remark was already forming, a single tear slipped down her cheek. Not a sob. Not a tremor. Just one tear, precise as a surgical drop, and she wiped it away without breaking his gaze. Without apology. Without looking away. That was worse for him than any anger would have been. It was the kind of composure that came from having already survived something worse. It was the kind of calm that belonged to people who didn't break. He walked away. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Brooke went to the unit board and removed the write-up. She didn't crumple it. She folded it once, very carefully, the way she'd been trained to fold things in another lifetime, in another identity, and she placed it in her pocket. She could feel Caldwell watching from his office doorway as she did this, could feel his frustration radiating like heat from a fever. He was already on his phone, already making calls, already trying to figure out how to escalate a problem that wouldn't respond to public humiliation. She headed to the stairwell and descended 2 flights, carrying the folded paper against her ribs. In the basement corridor, the air changed, colder, damper, the sound of the hospital's machinery echoing through concrete. She held the railing, her hand steady despite everything, and looked at the folded paper in her other hand. 3 years of invisibility. 3 years of competence going unrecognized. 3 years of being just a floor nurse. But that invisibility was about to end. She didn't know it yet. Nobody did. But somewhere on the 5th floor, a patient named Rahim was beginning to surface from his sedation, and his eyes were about to fill with memories of mortars and dust and a young army medic with hands steady enough to hold his insides together while the sky fell down in pieces. The stairwell door burst open above her, and the alarm started. Not the fire alarm. The emergency alarm. The one that meant someone was in crisis. The one that meant chaos was walking through the hallways of Seattle General at that exact moment, looking for the one person who'd understand what he'd survived. Brooke didn't move for 3 seconds. Then she climbed the stairs back toward the 5th floor, toward the sound of screaming in a language she hadn't spoken in 20 years, toward a man whose life she'd already saved once and who was about to blow her invisibility to pieces with a single cry of recognition. The double doors to the 5th floor burst open. He came through like a breaching charge, 6 feet 5 inches of trauma and muscle and bare chest visible through the torn hospital gown, bandages already seeping through with fresh blood. His eyes were wild, scanning the hallway for targets that existed only in his mind. He was screaming in Pashto, the words spilling over each other, and Brooke could understand every single one. They're coming. Get down. Incoming fire. An orderly who'd been wheeling a medication cart dropped it and bolted for the stairwell. A resident who'd been reviewing charts flattened herself against the wall, then ran. A nurse hit the panic button and the alarm shrieked through the hospital. Caldwell emerged from a patient room, took one look at the chaos, and retreated back inside, locking the door with an audible click. The patient, Rahim on his wristband, grabbed a mobile for stand and swung it like a weapon. Metal clanged against the wall. The stand's bag of saline exploded in a spray of clear liquid. His massive frame filled the corridor, and the hallway cleared in seconds. Everyone running. Everyone hiding. Everyone except one. Brooke Sullivan stood at the nurse's station 60 feet away. She didn't move toward the exit. Her eyes locked on his face, and recognition flickered across her features like a current. Those eyes. The same dark eyes she'd seen 20 years ago in Marja, on a 7-year-old boy whose intestines she'd held inside his body while mortars walked closer and her hands never shook. She whispered to herself, Rahim. Her hands moved to her sides, palms visible, disarming. She began walking directly toward him. Every step deliberate, measured. The alarm wailed. His screams echoed off tile walls. But she kept moving toward the chaos instead of away from it, the way heroes do when everyone else has learned to run. She spoke, voice low and steady, words in Pashto coming from a part of her identity she'd buried for 20 years, Rahim. It's okay. You're safe. I'm here. He didn't hear her yet, still lost in the flashback, still fighting enemies that didn't exist. She kept walking. 10 feet away now. His eyes began to focus, recognition starting to dawn in that face she'd never forgotten. His eyes locked on hers. Recognition flickered across his face like a light switch being thrown. The name came out in a whisper, then louder, a sound caught between a prayer and a scream. Brooke! He knew her voice. After 20 years, through morphine and fever and the particular kind of terror that lives in a man who survived something that shouldn't have survived, he knew her voice. Rahim's grip on the four-stand loosened. His breathing shifted from rapid animal panic to something more human, more present. The hallway around them remained silent. The orderlies and doctors hadn't dared to return. Just Brooke and the man she'd held together on a stretcher in a dust cloud while rounds impacted the earth around them. I know you, he gasped in English, his accent thick and fractured. Your voice, I know that voice. Brooke stepped closer, her movements careful and deliberate, the way a handler approaches a spooked horse. Not threatening. Not retreating. Just present. Marja, she said quietly. 20 years ago. You were 7. His face contorted. His hand reached out, trembling, and she let him grip her forearm. His fingers were cold, shaking. His other hand was still pressed to his thigh where the bandages had been soaked through, rust-colored blood spreading across white gauze like watercolor on paper. The shrapnel wound. The stateside attack that had brought him to Seattle General 3 days ago with a classified medical record and a name she'd never expected to see on her patient roster again. His knees buckled. "Raheem, look at me." Her voice didn't rise, but it changed. The deferential nurse disappeared. The command tone surfaced, the one she'd learned in 2004 when she was 26 years old and holding a child's intestines inside his body while calling in airstrikes. "You're in San Diego. Seattle General Hospital. The mortars are gone. You're safe." He nodded, but his eyes had already begun to glaze. His grip on her arm tightened, then weakened. Blood was pooling now, spreading across the tile floor in a pattern that told her everything she needed to know about pressure and velocity and how much time remained before his body decided to shut down. The femoral artery. It had to be. "I need pressure dressings," she called out, but the hallway was empty. The skeleton crew that worked the 5th floor at 2:13 in the morning had scattered like birds from a gunshot. She was alone with a bleeding man and a supply cart 30 feet away. Brooke caught Raheem as he dropped, his full weight, maybe 190 pounds of wounded muscle and trauma, settling against her. She lowered him to the floor with control, her hands already moving. 20 years of civilian nursing, 17 years before that of field medicine, 40 pounds lighter than him but moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Who'd done this under fire? She ripped open the supply cart with one hand, fingers finding gauze, tape, anything useful. But it wasn't enough. Gauze soaked through in seconds when an artery was compromised. She needed pressure. She needed a seal. She needed something that would create hydraulic tension against the wound site and buy time for the surgical team that wasn't here yet. Her eye scanned the hallway. An abandoned meal tray near room 512. A veteran patient's belongings, half-empty MRE package on the floor beside a reclining chair where someone's family member had fallen asleep waiting for visiting hours. She grabbed the package, tore it open with her teeth, extracted the flexible plastic inner packaging that had protected the meal components. The plastic was waterproof. Flexible. Adhesive at the edges. It was a battlefield chest seal, and she was going to use it on an arterial bleed because it was what she had. She positioned Raheem's leg at a 45-degree angle, exposed the thigh wound. The gauze fell away. She saw the artery, not spurting, which meant pressure had already begun to tamponade it, but actively weeping dark red in a pattern that told her the wound was clean and the vessel was compromised. She applied the plastic seal directly over the wound, pressing down with the heel of her hand, then added 4 layers of gauze on top, compressing at an angle calculated to put maximum pressure on the arterial entry point while maintaining circulation to the lower leg. Combat pressure. The kind you learn when your first triage patient is a child in a bombed medical clinic and the next 3 hours are the most important 3 hours of his life. Raheem's breathing steadied. His eyes began to clear. "You," he whispered, his hand reaching up to grip her wrist. "Marja. The medic. You saved me. You saved my life." Brooke's face remained professional, composed, the expression of a skilled nurse managing a trauma patient. But her hands were something else entirely. Her hands were those of a major in the United States Army Special Forces Medical Corps, and they moved with a precision that shouldn't have existed in a civilian hospital at nearly 3 in the morning. The elevator dinged at the far end of the hallway. Security arrived first. 2 officers moving fast, radios crackling with code she didn't need to translate. Then the trauma team, residents and nurses, someone pushing a gurney. The organized chaos of people who'd been trained for exactly this scenario but who weren't trained for the woman on the floor whose hands were steady as surgical lasers, whose voice was giving orders in a tone that made everyone move faster. "Femoral artery compromise," she said as they arrived. "Field pressure dressing applied. Distal circulation intact. Last vitals before decompensation were BP 94/62, heart rate 118, O2 sat 94 on room air. She said it all from memory. She said it like someone who'd been calling in casualties for 2 decades. But there was someone else watching from the hallway's far end, someone who'd emerged from his hiding place only after the danger had passed. Dr. Marcus Caldwell stood in the doorway of the medication room, observing the scene with an expression that shifted in real time, fear giving way to calculation, calculation giving way to opportunity. He pulled his phone from his pocket with the deliberate movement of a man who'd just realized he was holding a loaded gun. He photographed Brooke on the floor. Brooke's hands on the patient. The improvised dressing that no civilian nurse should have known how to construct. The blood. The authority in her voice. The military precision of her movements. The photograph was perfect. Damning. Evidence of unauthorized physical intervention, practicing beyond license, every violation he'd been looking for since the day she'd questioned his post-op protocol. Unauthorized physical intervention, he muttered to himself, already composing the incident report in his mind. His fingers moved across his phone screen. 3 calls. First to the hospital board, a courtesy, a heads-up that something urgent would be coming. Second to his colleague on the medical ethics committee, a personal friend who owed him favors. Third to an administrator whose career Caldwell had salvaged 5 years ago, a debt that had been accumulating interest ever since. The words came out soft, practiced. We have a significant compliance issue. Yes, I have documentation. Yes, I witnessed it directly. We need to move quickly. The gurney was rolling now. Raheem's hand had released Brooke's wrist, and she stood, movements fluid, her uniform covered in blood but her eyes clear and her breathing controlled. She was already moving toward the elevator, already preparing to ride down to surgery with the patient, already positioned in the role of his nurse. Caldwell watched from above as the elevator doors slid open. Brooke stepped inside, her hand on Raheem's shoulder, her voice low and steady. You're going to surgery. The best surgical team in California. You're going to be okay. The doors closed. The elevator began to descend. Caldwell remained in the hallway, phone still in his hand, the photograph still glowing on his screen. Around him, the 5th floor of Seattle General returned to its artificial quiet, fluorescent lights humming their constant song, monitors beeping in distant rooms, the sound of the building's fax system settling like the breathing of something vast and indifferent. He smiled. He shouldn't have smiled. But he did. And that was the last moment Dr. Marcus Caldwell understood what was about to happen to him. That was the last moment before every decision he'd made came rushing back toward him like a wave returning to shore. That was the moment before a classified file began its journey from a secure server in Washington to the desk of a federal investigator. But he didn't know that yet. He only knew that he had her now. He had evidence. He had witnesses. He had 3 phone calls already made to people who could make problems disappear. He had no idea that the woman in the elevator was going to make his entire career disappear instead. The femoral artery was screaming. Brooke's hands moved on their own, muscle memory that had no business belonging to a civilian floor nurse. She used the pressure dressing technique from Marja, improvised chest seal from an MRE package in the trauma cart, modified for hemorrhage control, applied directly to the wound site with the kind of precision that came from holding intestines inside a 7-year-old's abdomen while mortar fire chewed the adobe walls apart. Her voice stayed low, steady, still in Pashto. Breathe, Raheem. In through your nose. Out through your mouth. You're safe now. You're in America. You're home. The bleeding stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The tourniquet effect held. His breathing steadied. The panic in his eyes faded into something almost like recognition, like he'd just remembered what it felt like to be held by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The room held its breath. Nurses stood frozen at the monitor. The on-call resident stared at the dressing, clean, effective, impossible. And Dr. Marcus Caldwell stood 3 feet away, iPhone raised, recording every second of it. He wasn't recording to help. He was recording evidence. Evidence of a floor nurse performing field surgical technique that required training no civilian hospital credential could cover. Evidence of someone operating outside her license. Evidence he could use. Caldwell lowered the phone with a satisfied expression of a man who'd just watched his opponent walk into a trap of his own making. He excused himself from the trauma bay with quiet courtesy, like he was leaving a tennis match he'd already won. 30 seconds later, his footsteps echoed down the corridor toward the administrative wing. By the time Raheen's bleeding had fully stabilized, Caldwell was already in his office making phone calls. Not angry calls. Strategic ones. The first call went to James Sterling, the hospital board chairman, a man whose medical foundation had just received a $50,000 donation from Caldwell's research fund last fiscal year. James, we have a regulatory compliance issue on the MedSurg floor. A nurse performed an authorized physical intervention on a patient, clear scope violation. I wanted to bring it to your attention before this becomes a liability exposure. Sterling listened. Caldwell didn't need to say more. Liability was a word board chairmen understood in their sleep. The second call went to Dr. Patricia Hayes, Caldwell's colleague on the Medical Ethics Committee, a woman who'd been passed over for chief of surgery 6 years ago when Caldwell got the position instead. She'd resented him quietly ever since, but she owed him. He'd supported her daughter's residency application at Johns Hopkins last spring. One phone call to a colleague. That's all it had taken. Patricia, I need to escalate something to the Ethics Committee. Patient safety issue. Can we convene emergency session? She said yes before he finished the sentence. The third call was different. This one went to Tom Bennett, the hospital's administrative director, a man who divorced badly, spent money like it was being discontinued, and had made some choices with his personal assistant that he'd prefer stayed personal. Caldwell knew because Caldwell made it his business to know. Tom, terrible situation developing on MedSurg. I hate to bring this up, but I need someone on the board who understands the gravity. Can I count on your discretion? The pause on the line lasted exactly 2 seconds. Absolutely, Marcus. Whatever you need. Within 24 hours, Brooke arrived at the entrance to Seattle General and her badge didn't scan. The security guard, young, apologetic, avoiding her eyes, said, "You're on restricted access pending investigation." The words came from somewhere above him, from protocols and phone calls and institutional machinery that had already decided. 2 hours later, a human resources director who'd never spoken to her before sat across from a desk she didn't recognize and read aloud, "Unauthorized physical intervention beyond scope of nursing practice. Performing medical procedures without licensure. Violation of hospital protocol. Immediate suspension pending formal investigation." The letter was dated this morning. It was signed by Dr. Caldwell and countersigned by the board chairman. Brooke had 20 minutes to clear her locker. She didn't argue. She didn't demand a hearing. She didn't even ask for specifics. She simply nodded, took the letter, and walked to locker number 247 on the 3rd floor. Everything she had at Seattle General fit into a cardboard box, a coffee mug with Seattle General Nursing Excellence printed on the side, a joke now, a relic from a title that no longer applied. A photograph of Ethan from his 8th grade graduation, 5 years ago, before he grew tall and learned her secrets. A stethoscope she'd bought on sale at CVS. A locker key. That was all. That was everything. She didn't take the uniform. They wanted the uniform back. 48 hours later, at 10 o'clock in the morning, she stood in the basement laundry room of Seattle General and folded her scrubs for the final time. The industrial washers hummed. Steam rose from the dryers like ghosts. The laundry attendant, an older man named Marcus who'd worked there longer than she had, watched silently from the corner, already knowing. The scrubs were still warm. She folded them with the precision of someone who'd been trained in the military tradition of respect for uniform, each sleeve creased with exactness, corners aligned at perfect 90-degree angles, as if she were folding a flag at a funeral. Because that's what this was. A funeral. The death of a 3-year reign of invisibility. The death of the version of herself that had learned to be small, to be quiet, to let herself be dismissed by men who'd never saved a life in the dark. Her hands trembled once, not from fear, but from restraint. The kind of trembling that comes from holding everything back, from being trained to stay silent, to never surface, never claim what you were. The kind of trembling only someone who'd held people together would understand. She placed the folded scrubs in the collection bin and straightened. The faded unit patch from Marja was still inside her jacket lining, pressed against her ribs where her heart kept time like a clock counting down to something. She didn't remove it. She couldn't. It was the only piece of proof she had that she'd ever been anyone at all. The service elevator opened with a mechanical wheeze. She stepped inside, box under her arm, and rode down to the ground level. The doors opened on the parking lot. Rain had started while she was underground, a cold October rain that smelled like diesel and wet concrete. She walked toward her car, civilian clothes fitting wrong on her frame, like a costume she'd never learned to wear. The cardboard box was light enough. That was the worst part. Everything she'd built at Seattle General was light enough to carry with one arm. That's when she heard it. "Mom!" A shout across the parking lot. Running footsteps. Ethan, her 16-year-old son, who was supposed to be in school, who had a calculus test third period, who should not have been here, was sprinting toward her across the wet asphalt. He was holding something against his chest. Something metallic. Something that caught the light and gleamed. She recognized it before her mind could process what that meant. The shadow box. The one she kept in the back of her bedroom closet, buried under winter clothes and old boxes, behind a locked cabinet that she'd told him never, under any circumstances, to open. The one that contained 7 decorations she'd earned and sworn never to speak of. The one that proved she'd been someone before the erasure order. Before the instruction to disappear. Before Seattle General. Before becoming invisible. "Mom, they need to see these," Ethan gasped, breathless from running. His voice cracked with the particular courage of teenagers who don't yet understand the cost of speaking truths that were supposed to stay buried. "You can't let him win. You can't just let him do this to you." She reached for the shadow box. She meant to take it, to close it, to put it back where buried things belong. But Ethan was already moving past her, already running toward the lobby doors. Already doing the one thing that would change everything. She was carrying a cardboard box to her car when she saw him. Ethan. Her 16-year-old son running across the parking lot like his life depended on it, her shadow box clutched against his chest like a shield. The medals inside caught the afternoon light, silver star, bronze star with Valor, purple heart, 3 decades of classified service compressed into a wooden frame the size of a showbox. She set the box down on the curb and opened her mouth to stop him, but Ethan was already past her, already running toward the lobby doors. Already doing the one thing that would change everything. "Ethan, no," the words died in her throat. He didn't hear her. Or he heard and didn't care. The lobby doors burst open and he walked straight into the emergency board meeting that Dr. Caldwell had convened to finalize her termination. 7 board members sat around a polished conference table. 2 hospital attorneys flanked Caldwell like bodyguards. The hospital president checked her watch. This was supposed to take 15 minutes. Brooke Sullivan would be erased by 3:08 p.m. That's when Ethan's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "My mom is Major Brooke Sullivan, Special Forces." The room didn't just go quiet. The room imploded. Air seemed to vanish. Pen stopped moving. One of the attorneys actually stood up, then sat back down without knowing why. Caldwell's face went the color of old bone. He started to speak, some reflexive defense, some institutional response, but his voice came out thin, almost a whisper. A hospital attorney, a woman named Chen with steady hands and steadier eyes, rose slowly from her chair. She took the shadow box from Ethan with trembling fingers. Not from fear. From the weight of what she was holding. She opened the frame and read the inscriptions aloud, each word a sentence, each medal or indictment. Silver Star. For Valor. For leadership under fire. She paused. The room held its breath. Bronze Star with Valor device. For heroism in ground combat. Another pause. The clock above the door ticked. Purple Heart. 2 of them. 2 separate wounds. 2 separate combat tours. Chen's voice cracked, just barely, on the final words. Navy Commendation Medal. Combat Medic Ribbon. And... She stopped, looking at the final medal as if she were holding the Ark of the Covenant. A Joint Service Commendation Medal. Classified Operations. 2003 to 2004. Caldwell tried to stand. His chair scraped backward. No one helped him. No one even looked at him. They were all staring at the medals, at the shadow box, at the proof that they had been sitting in a room about to destroy a woman they didn't understand, didn't deserve to judge, and certainly didn't have the authority to fire. Then the wheelchair wheel squeaked on the tile floor. Raheem appeared in the doorway of the boardroom, one arm still strapped against his ribs, his femoral wound healing beneath layers of gauze Brooke had dressed herself. His face was angular, weathered by 2 decades of living in a country that had tried to kill him. He moved with the careful precision of someone learning to walk again. Behind him, hospital security, who had received no orders to admit him, stood silently. They knew. Everyone in this hospital knew. Raheem's voice came out steady, accented English shaped by Pashto, shaped by trauma, shaped by the memory of a young American medic kneeling in the dust of Marja while mortars landed close enough to make the ground tremble. She is the SEAL team medic who held my intestines inside my body while calling in airstrikes. She has 3 confirmed combat saves under fire and carried me 6 kilometers to extraction. He paused, and when he continued, his voice didn't waver. I was 7 years old. I am alive because of her. Not because of a protocol. Not because of a policy. Because she is more warrior than any of you will ever be. The silence after that was so thick you could operate in it. Caldwell's phone rang. Then rang again. Then again. He ignored it. He was staring at his hands, the hands that had written the termination letter, that had made 3 phone calls to orchestrate her destruction, that had signed post-operative notes he had altered to hide his mistakes. Those hands looked like they belonged to someone else now. Someone smaller. The boardroom doors opened and a woman in a navy suit entered, her credentials hanging from a lanyard. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Institutional Affairs Division. She carried a manila folder the thickness of a medical encyclopedia. Dr. Marcus Caldwell. She didn't wait for an answer. Your complaint regarding Major Sullivan triggered a federal audit of patient records under your surgical oversight. We found 17 discrepancies between your post-operative documentation and actual patient outcomes. In one case, the sepsis patient Major Sullivan flagged, you altered the timeline of complications to avoid a mortality review. That patient's family has already filed a civil suit. The FBI agent's voice was clinical, precise, without mercy. Your medical license in 3 states is suspended effective immediately. Your hospital privileges are revoked. You're being referred to the United States Attorney for the District of California for charges of patient endangerment and falsification of federal medical records. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say. I want to speak to a lawyer, Caldwell said. The words came out hollow, rehearsed, like he'd heard them in a movie once and now was reading from a script written in someone else's language. Security took him by the elbow. Not roughly. Just firmly. He stood, and Chen, the hospital attorney, placed the shadow box on the conference table. The medals gleamed under the boardroom lights. No one touched them. They just sat there, visible at last, undeniable, impossible to unsee. 6 months later, Brooke sat in her new office on the 5th floor of Seattle General, the title plate on her door reading Chief Nursing Officer. She had earned the position not with politics or tenure, but because the hospital's president had watched her walk toward danger while everyone else scattered. Because she had the command presence of someone who had made life-or-death decisions at 26 years old in a combat zone most of these administrators couldn't find on a map. The commendation board hung on the wall outside her office. Her photograph was centered at the top, not in a posed corporate headshot, but in her dress uniform, the photo released from classified archives as part of her official reinstatement. Underneath, Major Brooke Sullivan, Chief Nursing Officer. For exemplary service in crisis response and unwavering commitment to patient safety. She had hung one item in her office itself. A shadow box, identical in size to her medals, but containing something different. A faded unit patch from the 3rd Battalion of her Special Forces Regiment, colors worn by sand and time. The patch had lived in the lining of her jacket for 3 years, a ghost of who she was, a reminder of the woman she had never stopped being. Now it was visible. Now it was honored. Her hand rested against the inside of the jacket hanging on her chair. She could feel the slight bulge where the patch had once been. The absence was its own kind of presence. The space where a secret had lived was now just cloth and air. She had other jackets now. She didn't need to hide anymore. Ethan knocked on the open door at 12:11 p.m., right on schedule for lunch. He was carrying takeout from the Thai place they liked, the one 3 blocks from the hospital. He grinned when he saw the unit patch in the shadow box. Still getting used to seeing that out in the open, he asked. Still getting used to a lot of things, Brooke replied. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, the same chair where administrative meetings had once been conducted, where disciplinary conversations had taken place. Now it was just a place for her son to sit. You hungry? Starving? Also, there's a patient in 412 who wants to meet you. Says you saved his life in Afghanistan. That would be Rahim. He's been here twice since the reinstatement. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that only exists between people who have survived something together. Outside the window, San Diego stretched out toward the Pacific. Somewhere in the sprawl of neighborhoods and strip malls, Dr. Marcus Caldwell was sitting at a folding table under a faded canopy, selling discount insurance to people who didn't want it. His medical license was gone. His reputation was gone. His career was a cautionary tale told in hospital corridors to remind young doctors what happens when you mistake authority for competence. She didn't gloat about it. She didn't drive past to see his fall. That wasn't her style. But she knew. Everyone knew. You think he's suffering? Ethan asked, reading her mind the way he always did. I think he's finally understanding that actions have consequences. That's not what I asked. Brooke set down her fork. She looked at her son, this young man who had the courage to run into a boardroom with her medals held high, who had chosen her over comfort, who had believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself. No. I hope he's learning. I hope somewhere in whatever he's doing now, he's realizing that the people he tried to destroy were stronger than he ever was. But I don't waste energy suffering for him. He did that himself. After Ethan left to return to school, Brooke walked the 5th floor corridor. Staff greeted her, not with the deferential nods of people addressing a boss, but with genuine respect. Nurses who had once scattered like rabbits when she entered a room now approached her with case questions, with difficult decisions, with problems that required the kind of wisdom you only earned through fire. She had become what she always was. Everyone was just finally seeing it. She stopped at the patient rooms, checking on Rahim in 412. He was reading, his leg propped on pillows, healing steadily. When he saw her, he smiled, the smile of someone who had spent 20 years waiting for his savior to stop being invisible. How's the pain? She asked. Better. Dr. Chen says I can probably go home next week. Then we'll make sure you know how to manage the wound dressing. I'll arrange for a home health nurse, but you remember the technique, yes? The pressure, the angle. I remember everything, he said quietly. Every moment. I never stopped knowing who you were. That night, alone in her apartment, Brooke stood in front of her bathroom mirror and removed the jacket she had worn for 3 years. The one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. The fabric was worn thin from her wearing it every single day, through seasons of invisibility, through humiliation, through the lowest moment of her life when she had folded her scrubs in a hospital basement laundry room and thought she was done. She didn't need it anymore. But she would keep it anyway. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who remember where they came from. Who don't erase the hard parts. Who carry their scars on the inside where no one asks questions. The next morning, she walked into Seattle General wearing a new jacket. No hidden patches. No secrets. Just a chief nursing officer with a military bearing and hands that had held people together in places most people would never have to see. When the trauma code came in at 9:53 a.m., a car accident, 3 patients, critical injuries, the ED staff moved with the precision of an orchestra. And at the center of it all was Brooke, her voice steady, her decision swift, her presence exactly what these people needed. She didn't give orders like she was performing authority. She gave orders like someone who had done this 1,000 times before, in a desert where the stakes were measured in heartbeats. By 10:34 a.m., all 3 patients were stable. The trauma surgeon looked across the bay at Brooke and nodded, the kind of nod you give to someone who has just reminded you why you became a doctor in the first place. She didn't celebrate. She just moved to the next patient, and the next crisis, and the next moment where someone needed a warrior with a stethoscope instead of a gun. And that was enough. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you made it this far, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Brooke's position? Would you have let your son expose the truth, or tried to protect him from the consequences? Drop your answer in the comments below, and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Stories like this remind us that the quietest people in the room might just be holding it all together. Thank you for watching.